Hello! So in this video, I'm going to talk about a very important tool that I have used a ton in the past year in diving deeper into my emotional awakening, and that's the tool of shadow work. So what is shadow work and what's the shadow? So the shadow is basically the subconscious aspects of our mind or of our being that we repress or we may be unable to see, right? And the whole kind of premise of shadow work is that when we're born whole and we're born complete and we're born perfect, almost like 100% aligned with our higher self and our inner being. And then as we are raised in a family and society through conditioning, through trauma, through all sorts of different events, we become fragmented, right? Through these different experiences, we disassociate from that wholeness, from that completion, that experience or that feeling of oneness and perfection, and we disassociate and we fragment parts of ourselves, which become basically our subconscious mind. And so for a spiritual seeker, someone who's desiring to deepen their spiritual connection, their connection with their higher self, shadow work is a really, really important ingredient because, we can't be light workers unless we do the shadow work too, right? So the light work is basically our conscious mind. It's using our thoughts to control and create our reality. But if we don't tend to the shadow work, right, the shadow is the parts of us that are actually dictating patterns and all sorts of behaviors in our lives that maybe we don't actually desire to be exhibiting, but we're partaking in these patterns or habits that aren't aligned with our highest self because of our repressed shadow. So in this video, I'm going to talk about different ways our shadow manifests and then some tools or helpful techniques that we can actually implement in order to do this very necessary shadow work. So this idea of the shadow was actually created or introduced in this particular way by Carl Jung. And one of my favorite quotes was this Carl Jung quote, which is where he says, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Right? So that's what I'm referring to, where we can basically be partaking or exhibiting all of these unconscious patterns, like, why do I always have that type of dynamic in all of my relationships, right? Or why do I always, keep going back to that habit or that addiction? So the reason is because there's that unconscious shadow, and until we make it conscious by shining the light of consciousness, of awareness, to that pattern, it's going to keep on controlling our life, and we'll call it fate. And it's just such a brilliant, beautiful quote. Okay, so basically, and the thing is that the shadow grows every single time we repress it, right? So if we are on a spiritual path, something that very commonly happens, and this is something that I did for many years, actually for almost a decade, is we understand like these laws of the universe, and our thoughts create our reality. So we keep on trying to program ourselves with these affirmations. So, I am this and I am that. But if we're not looking at the shadow, there's a disconnect. And, and it's actually basically a form of bypassing this deeper form of work, right? And a lot of times that's even referred to in the spiritual communities as spiritual bypassing, where it's like everything's rainbow and unicorns and everything's, fairy dust and sunshine. But if we're not doing the shadow work, we're not actually truly ever going to be able to arrive at that highest, most expansive part of our ideal lives, right? So there's different ways we dissociate from ourselves. There's different ways that this fragmentation occurs. So the first way is through projection, right? So in our everyday interactions, we can project certain beliefs, certain attitudes or opinions onto other people that may have no basis in reality. It's just a projection of our shadow. And it's usually reflecting back to us some unconscious, unhealed part of our inner selves, right? And that's why there's this this idea that everyone that we interface with in the world is actually a mirror, because we're just seeing that which we're putting out, right? So if you tend to continually attract certain people into your lives or certain circumstances into your lives where you're like always facing drama or you're always facing this pattern, chances are it's not them, it's you. What is it within your unconscious shadow that keeps attracting or gravitating towards those dynamics? Oftentimes we can actually be recreating a situation from our childhood unconsciously over and over. So we feel this like insane chemistry with this certain type of person and we don't know why. Well, it could be that they're, a soulmate and they're, in our soul family and we attracted them, but it could also be we're actually trauma bonding with this person because we're recreating this familiar pattern that's actually unconscious and very unhealthy, right? So the first way that our shadow tends to manifest is through projection. The next indication or the next area where our shadows might show up is through triggers, right? So certain things that trigger us, like, oh my gosh, I can't control it, I can't take it. Like even, I can speak for myself personally, like this happens in traffic all the time. Like even my son makes fun of me because he's like, mommy, you're like going off the handle and like nothing's happening here, right? So why is it that certain things trigger us more than others? So again, those triggers are actually a gateway. They're a portal for us to look at if we have the courage, if we're courageous enough to actually look into them. Why are they triggering us? That's an amazing invitation. It's an amazing portal into looking at our shadow on our unhealed, unconscious parts of ourselves. Now, the third really helpful area where the shadow will show up or manifest is in patterns, habits, addictions, behaviors, right? Like, every time I seem like I'm starting to gain momentum and thrive, then bam, this thing happens and it almost feels like I'm sabotaging myself or, the world is out to get me, right? Those are patterns that, again, this is our unconscious shadow continuing to resurface until we have the boldness, until we have the courage to actually look at it. And so our goal from all of these different shadow aspects that are presenting themselves is integration, is to shine the light of consciousness onto these shadows and then to integrate into this whole complete organism, into this light worker that we really are, right? And that's true light work. True light work is also embracing and acknowledging the shadow. So there's several ways to integrate our shadow, but the key element of all of them is just awareness, right? And Eckhart Tolle, which is one of my favorite spiritual teachers and authors, he has this amazing way of describing this where it's essentially like you're the witness, you're the observer, where you disidentify from these egoic parts of yourself and you're able to look at it almost as if you're a separate entity looking down on yourself, and you can see with awareness, oh, there's that habit, oh, there's that thing that I'm doing again, right? So the common thread with all of these tools and techniques is the awareness, right? Is shining consciousness. Okay, so one way to integrate the shadow is just by reviewing your childhood, right? So you can find so much out about your shadow through looking at your childhood. And oftentimes this will play out big time in relationships, right? So, there's the whole idea of attachment theory, and I'm totally going to be making videos in the future just on that one topic alone because it's so loaded. But just like a preview of coming attractions, just on a very surface general level, if we received love from our parents in a certain way, it's very likely that we're going to keep recreating or repeating that dynamic in our relationships, right? So this is one form of reviewing our childhood where we can gain insight, we can get wisdom from looking at what was the pattern in our childhood and how we may be repeating that pattern, or it's continually manifesting now in our adult day lives, our adult selves. Okay. The second is just to become aware of it, right? Just shine the light of consciousness on it. Like, oh, wow, I'm feeling this trigger really hard right now. I'm feeling really angry. I'm feeling really triggered. I'm feeling really uncomfortable. I'm feeling really jealous, right? And one of my favorite practices that I've learned in the past year through a lot of the work that I've done on myself, working on my shadow, working with plant medicine, is to actually just sit with that awareness and just sit with that emotion without actually doing anything, just being aware of it. Because the second that we bring awareness, now every time that pattern or that projection or that trigger comes up in life, it's like, pause the tape. Oh, there it is again, right? So awareness brings so much insight. Okay, now the third piece, the third tool that we can use is to release shame. Right? So a lot of the reason why our shadow has so much charge, it's not even because of the unconscious thing so much as oftentimes it's the shame that we feel around the thing that makes us hide it and not want to look at it and repress it. And the irony is that oftentimes, like that famous quote, on the other, everything you want is on the other side of fear, right? Like oftentimes when we actually dive deep into the thing and we just release the shame, it feels like the greatest relief. Like, oh wow, why was I making such a big deal out of it, right? And there's so many different ways you can practice this. Like a really fun one that I just learned in a recent course that I was taking is just actually doing things that just really like scare the crap out of you, that really challenge your sense of identity, challenge your ego to like break and shatter those old constructs, and to just put yourself in these very foreign, up-leveling, triggering situations almost on purpose. And by doing that, we release the shame and the hold that these repressed aspects of ourselves tend to hold over us, right? So releasing shame and just having compassion and acceptance is so big. In fact, I noticed recently a pattern that kept coming up in some of my dynamics and relationships, and I decided to actually have a ceremony where I celebrated that shadow part of myself by just sitting with the feeling, sitting with the emotion for an extended period of time. Because normally what we do is we feel so much shame that we feel the thing, that we don't allow ourselves to feel the thing, and then what we resist persists, and then it ends up like eating us alive, and we wonder, why are we walking through life feeling so disintegrated, right? So in order to integrate, one of the simplest things to do is just cut ourselves a break and just feel, wow, oh my gosh, I'm feeling this way, and let me have compassion for myself that I'm feeling this way, and like how bold and courageous I am for acknowledging the fact that I'm feeling this way. And let me just sit with that feeling and not shame myself on top of it. Because again, we're all whole and complete and perfect. And almost all of these shadowy parts of ourselves come from external influences, right? They come from societal conditioning, that come from family dynamics or trauma. And so if we can look at it that way, and we can just imagine that we're almost coaching the inner child in us. And if you're curious what I mean by that, I do have another video on inner child work and what that is. If we can just compassionately hold space for that inner child within us without judgment, without shame, we can feel often a huge diffusion of the discomfort and of those repressed emotions. So compassion, acceptance, embracing what is, releasing shame is a huge component. It's almost like the whole recipe of doing shadow work. Okay, the next way that we can integrate our shadow is actually by using our triggers to our advantage. So this is another theme that's really alive for me right now in my life, where I know there's a certain situation, there's certain dynamic that triggers me, and it sounds masochistic, but it's actually part of my spiritual work, is I'm actually intentionally putting myself over and over repeatedly in the face of the trigger, because I know the only way out is through, right? So I know if I run away from the trigger, it's going to keep haunting me. But if I create space for it and I allow it to consume me, and I use the trigger as a guide, I use the trigger as insight, I use the trigger as wisdom, now I'm not just like poking at these wounds and for the rest of my life feeling terrorized by them, but I'm actually using them as a source of alchemy and transmutation, and as a guide, as a way shower. Oh, there's a little unhealed, unconscious part of yourself. There's another wound. Oh, that's really interesting, right? But again, always non-judgmentally. And then, finally, there's a lot of different practices that we can use, like journaling, right? Journaling is a really amazing way to make parallels, to draw connections upon these different aspects and these different patterns that we can see repeating and replaying in our lives over and over again. And then again, just observe without judgment. So I already kind of talked about that a lot, but just, oh, there's that again, right? Observe without judgment. And it sounds so simple, but how often do we really give ourselves permission to observe our shadowy parts without judgment? Like, I know for me, that has been a huge just skill to learn, to develop, to feel like that's really the ultimate form of self-love, is to be able to look at the most gruesome, grimy, embarrassing, shameful parts of ourselves and just without judgment be like, I love you. I can observe you and not react and not feel triggered, because I create space for all of you, or all of me, right? Who's the you? I create space for all of myself, my light and my shadow. So yeah, that's basically like the main points of how to integrate the shadow. But the main thing is that 90% of transformation is really just in the awareness, right? So with all of these different tools, just starting off with becoming aware, reviewing the childhood, reviewing all of these different patterns, using our triggers, all of these are ways to just become aware of the shadow. And then the second most important piece is just creating space, non-judgmental space for it. So I hope you got some value from this video. I hope this video inspires you to connect with all the parts of yourself. It's not more spiritual to, bypass your emotion. It's not more spiritual to ignore, your wounds and your traumas, because they're going to be at play whether you choose to recognize them or not. So why not love yourself so fiercely that you create space for all of you in your spiritual path? So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some value from it. If you're not currently following me on Instagram, feel free to go and check out my Instagram profile. My handle is Awakening with Leah, and I look forward to connecting with you again really soon. Thank you so much.